Hello, everyone. We've still got some people logging in, but I think we are now live. So I'm going to start any second. Yeah, we can just see people piling in from the lobby. So hello, if you're just arriving, just watching the numbers tick up as you come into the room. Okay. So yeah, if you've just arrived, we're just letting people file in from our virtual lobby, and we'll just be starting in about a minute, I think. Just looking at the numbers. Okay, right. I think we have let everyone in that is actually waiting. So I'm gonna set off. So welcome to Eunomia's Fit for the Future webinar series on the European Union's packaging and packaging waste regulation. If you're here, you probably know that that replaces the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, and it's setting out the direction of European packaging policy for the foreseeable future. It feels like we've been watching the development of this policy for years, but the final version was signed off in December and entered into force in February, I think. So while the specific requirements in there have different lead-in times, and some of them do still seem quite far away, there's a huge amount of content in there that you might have to respond to. So it's definitely time to be thinking about the implications if you haven't already started to do so. And we're delighted to have you here today, wherever you are on your preparation journey. So just to quickly introduce ourselves, I'm Daniel Stunnell. I'm a managing consultant at Eunomia on our policy team, and I work extensively on food systems and packaging. My colleague Chiarina is going to be leading today's webinar. She's been deep diving into the regulation since the final text was approved in December, and there's nobody better to talk us through that today. Eunomia as a consultancy has been involved in the PPWR, its predecessor, the PPWD, and related EU policy areas on waste, materials, plastics, and single use since we were founded over 20 years ago. And we work right around the world on a range of circular economy, low carbon, and natural economy projects. If we just go on to the next slide, yeah, here's a selection of some of our packaging projects with clients right around the world. The map doesn't really convey it all. The European Union kind of comes under Belgium, for example, but obviously goes much, much wider. Same with a lot of our international corporate clients. We've only got their headquarter country on this diagram, and we've worked with like multiple state and provincial level jurisdictions, as well as corporates and national governments there. So just before I hand over to Chiarina, I'll just talk through webinar management for you. So we've turned microphones off. We'd ask you to use the question and answer function for questions. You should see the icon at the top of your screen. Feel free to put questions in as we go along. If you've got any technical issues that come up as well, put that in the Q&A, and our technical team will deal with that. Just to say, the webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing that recording. So if you're sensitive about being seen on screen, please turn your camera off. We're very happy to see our audience though, so that's entirely your choice. And yeah, in terms of that Q&A function, feel free to upvote questions that interest you if someone else has jumped in before you. The format for the session, we're going to have about 30 minutes of presentation from Chiarina, and then that leaves 15 minutes for questions. If we don't get to your question, we will come back to you by email. And then, yeah, these are our objectives for the session. So just before I hand over to Chiarina, by the end of this session, we hope you'll have a high-level knowledge of the PPWR. You'll have an understanding of how this policy might affect your business's activities and what you might need to be thinking about. And you'll know who you might want to speak to within Eunomia for further support on that. We won't be covering all the detail of the PPWR in 30 minutes, so this will be an overview, and we're going to spotlight recyclability in particular, but do reach out to us if you'd like a more detailed discussion on any of the topic areas. And with that, Chiarina, take us away.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Can you hear me all right? Is my microphone working? Lovely. Okay, so as Daniel said, this is going to be an overview. We're going to focus very much on how it affects packaging producers, and I'll touch in some elements in more detail around who is responsible, what are the requirements, and when they apply, and with a closer look at recyclability as an example. And then we're going to consider what are the next steps for your business? How do you address requirements in the light of remaining uncertainties? The PPWR provides for lots of things, but there's still things that are not yet determined, and they will be determined in future legal acts. So in light of this, we want to help you understand how you can prepare. If you wait, it will probably be too late to incorporate finalized requirements into packaging design. So how do you respond to that uncertainty? And overall, my goal is to translate provisions into plain English. So I really hope by the end, I will have succeeded. So the packaging and packaging waste regulation. It's the main law dealing with sustainable packaging design and waste management in the EU. The issue it's ultimately addressing is that packaging accounts for a very significant amount of material use. So, 40% of plastic in the EU is used for packaging, 50% of paper, and a third of municipal solid waste is packaging. Extraction and processing of natural resources to produce materials accounts for 25% of greenhouse gas emissions globally and 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress. So significant proportions of those impacts are because of packaging. And then there's marine litter and microplastics. So the law addresses these issues by promoting greater material circularity by a variety of approaches, reducing packaging waste on one hand and improving recycling rates on the other. And it does that through improving design for recyclability and also increasing recycled content in packaging by putting targets on how much recycled content must be included for plastic in particular, which is a problem area. So it replaces the packaging and packaging waste directive. So a regulation has replaced a directive. A regulation enters into force immediately as it is in a member state, whereas a directive is transposed separately into each member state's law. And this leads to variation in how this is implemented in each member state. And so a regulation has a shorter lead-in time, and in theory, it should be more harmonized between member states. In addition, a regulation can obligate a wide range of actors, commercial entities and individuals, as well as the member states, whereas a directive can only say what a member state must do, who then has to delegate those responsibilities onto other actors. So a regulation can give more specific and hence clearer provisions for particular economic operators. And so hopefully there would also be fewer implementation gaps. And this is one of the reasons why, the packaging waste regulation has been drafted and enacted. So we hope there will be fewer implementation gaps. So the biggest new things compared to the preceding directive, the waste reduction targets, so on the top left, these represent the first ever quantitative waste reduction targets for most countries. And I know France is an exception, but for most countries, this is a big first. They're very ambitious. 15% reduction in packaging waste by 2040 on 2018 levels actually translates to a 40% reduction compared to business as usual, because packaging and waste generation is forecast to increase in the absence of any intervention. So they're really, really ambitious. To support this, there are mandatory reuse targets for beverages at 10% by 2030. And for example, takeaway food, the option should be provided to have that via a reuse system. Within 3 years, that option must be provided. These targets are modest, but they would lead to significant widespread change across Europe, because the new infrastructure necessary lays a foundation for a fairer playing field between single-use and reusable packaging. There are also restrictions of particular single-use items, particularly plastic items. For example, plastic food and beverage containers filled at point of sale where dining in for catering businesses, and those help to contribute to the reduction of packaging waste. And so taking us over to recycling targets, national recycling targets won't change because they were already not being achieved by many member states. So they're going to be supported instead by the following measures. Mandatory DRS, that's big. It's going to lead to widespread change across Europe in terms of infrastructure and collection modes. And it's accompanied by a 90% collection target that now includes cans, which also must be included in the deposit refund system. Sorry, DRS, deposit refund system. So previously it was just bottles, plastic bottles, and now cans are included too. Recyclability requirements. These are going to be defined for the first time what constitutes packaging that is designed for recyclability. And it means that as they're defined, they'll be enforceable. Packaging not meeting requirements will be banned. And that previously wasn't really possible because recyclability was never defined. For the recycled content targets, they're going to improve the market for the resulting materials from recycling processes. It builds on the single-use plastic directive, which was just recycled content targets for plastic beverage bottles, and it's going to be a really broad scope. So all plastic packaging is included in the scope of one of the recycled content targets. There's 4 different ones depending on the type of plastic and item. And so this will really transform the market for recycled plastic. So that's my sweeping view of the big hitting new elements in the PPWR compared to the preceding directive. So how is this going to influence packaging producers? So packaging producers must comply with sustainability requirements on one hand, and we have these on the left, and extended producer responsibility for end-of-life management, and that's covered on the right. The sustainability requirements, they replace the essential requirements for those who are familiar with those from the Packaging and Waste Directive, which were a bit vague. They did say that packaging had to be minimized and it must permit reuse or recovery, but it was too vague to be easily enforceable, and a lot of manufacturers were not really aware of the essential requirements. So the sustainability requirements, they cover a lot more topics and the requirements are more tightly defined. The waste hierarchy is better supported, with recyclability clearly prioritized over packaging minimization because of the stipulation that all packaging must be recyclable first of all. So EPR on the right-hand side, in general, this means, packaging producers must cover the costs of end-of-life waste management for their packaging. And in general, the scope of EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, it defers to the scope of the Waste Framework Directive, but there are some new elements in scope. The first element, recycling, collection, transport and treatment, that's as per the Waste Framework Directive, that hasn't changed. That was in the minimum requirements for EPR there. And also that this should include business premises. That was already in the Waste Framework Directive. But a new element is recycling collection in public spaces, which is essentially recycling on the go for litter. The Waste Framework Directive already had a fairly broad scope in terms of what packaging was in scope. All packaging placed on the market from all activities, whether household and commercial, is in the scope of the EPR, but a new requirement is that waste receptacles, the cost of the labeling of waste receptacles for separate collection, the cost of that should be covered by EPR. A new mandatory requirement is that EPR fees will be modulated according to recyclability. We'll cover this in more detail in the next section. And also a new provision is that a minimum share of EPR fees should be dedicated to waste prevention. And that was a long-standing issue that in terms of implementing the waste hierarchy properly, that there wasn't enough funding for waste prevention, and this aims to address that. And then we have some optional things. Member states are allowed to include litter cleanup in the scope of EPR fees. It's not mandatory, but they are allowed to. The same applies to fee modulation for recycled content. That is permitted, but it is not mandatory. And then the potential funding of producer guarantee fund. Now, it's mandatory, it will be mandatory under the PPWR for producers to provide a guarantee so that in the event that they are not compliant and they haven't paid fees or that they go bust, then member states can recover costs. But what is optional is that this may take the form of a fund that is financed by EPR fees. So it's the nature of the fund that is to be determined, and that might be financed by EPR fees. But it is mandatory for producers to provide a guarantee. And that's we'll cover that again later. And it is also under the Waste Framework Directive, member states are at liberty to charge for to recover the costs of all kinds of waste collection and treatment, not just recycling. Very few do, but that's something they are allowed to do. And so those are the main two areas, sustainability requirements on one hand and EPR on the other, that will be affecting packaging producers. However, that affects them directly. However, there are targets which are the responsibility of national governments and other economic operators, but they'll have big implications for packaging producers. So we already talked a bit about those very ambitious waste reduction targets. And in order to meet those, member states are going to have to put in place a lot of very ambitious supporting measures. The PPWR is a bit vague on those, but they do say that it's mandatory for member states to implement additional measures. So they are going to have to do that to support the waste reduction targets. That might include other economic measures like charges on single-use items. Member states must take measures to encourage the setup of reuse systems, and they are allowed to implement further and more ambitious reuse targets. So, you know, even though the reuse targets themselves are actually the responsibility of users and retailers, there is an opportunity there for packaging producers to supply the packaging to meet reuse quotas. So they are going to be influenced by these targets and requirements, even though they're not directly responsible for them. Another thing is that member states are left to determine exactly what the scope of EPR fees are going to be and the operational rules, and the modulated fee levels, those are going to be determined at member state level. And so what is going to happen is a little bit uncertain. And also DRS and the minimum requirements for deposit systems, it's up to member states to make sure those requirements are satisfied, but obviously they will influence producers a great deal. And also setting penalties and fines, that's for member states to do, but they will vary depending, and they're mandatory, member states have to do that, but they will vary between member states. Obviously, they're going to be really influential on producers. Okay, so that's a really big overview of how packaging producers would be influenced. And I wanted to think about a plain English way of explaining how producers can ensure compliance and prepare for it. So for each packaging type, and we're going to start with the sustainability requirements here. For each packaging type, the following things have to be considered. So does the packaging meet design for recycling requirements? We'll go over what those are in a few slides. Is it recycled at scale? And initially that will mean, is it recycled to more than 55%? Does it have enough recycled content? Does it comply with labeling requirements? Does reusable packaging complete minimum rotations? Is the minimum necessary packaging used? And do non-mandatorily compostable items allow material recycling? We're not going to be able to go into detail about compostable items, but that is a requirement. And is the packaging restricted under Annex 5 or single-use plastic directive amendments? Is it in that list of restricted packaging? And so the manufacturer has to determine what sustainability requirements are applicable. So this is the full list, but the manufacturer has to determine which requirements are applicable and how compliance must be demonstrated in terms of what data and evidence to supply. And that's something that we can help with. And then after completing the conformity assessment procedure and the declaration of conformity, it has to keep these documents on file and provide them to authorities on request. It's 5 years for single-use packaging, 10 years for multi-use or reusable packaging. That's those abbreviations. And so on the right-hand side here is a very brief summary of requirements that confer compliance with EPR obligations. So a packaging producer has to register with a producer responsibility organization or directly with the producer register, one or the other. It can, as is currently the case, it can mandate an organization to comply with EPR on its behalf. It has to report data on packaging placed on the market. This is one of the things that's notable. It's for 22 different material and format categories. And one of the things that enables is the design for recycling requirements and the fee modulation according to the design for recycling requirements. And that's a big change because it previously was 6 categories in most schemes, which are paper, card, glass, plastic, 2 kinds of metal and wood. So that's going to be a big change. Smaller businesses can stick with the old method, but for bigger businesses, that's a big reporting requirement. And then a producer would have to pay EPR fees due per ton of packaging. So that's a very, very simple run through of how a producer would become compliant. I also want to make the point that all of these requirements, they're EU specific, and obviously the UK has its own EPR scheme and its own, for example, recyclability assessment mechanism. But these requirements will be influential for multinationals or producers selling into the EU who will need to meet these requirements. And they often need to answer the question, what's the bar to meet to be on the market in as many places as possible so that they can limit the number of product lines that they're trying to make. And the EU often is the bar to meet because it's the most stringent in terms of requirements, and it often has the biggest sanctions. So yeah, this will influence producers outside the EU. It has broader implications. Then who will be overseeing the implementation of the PPWR? Member states, competent authorities, and market surveillance authorities are the main actors, but economic operators all have a role to play in terms of enforcing sustainability requirements and EPR. And the Commission will adjudicate on measures taken to withdraw or recall or restrict items if they're disputed. And so in a little tiny bit more detail, competent authorities are designated by each member state to audit the accuracy of a proportion of the declarations of conformity with sustainability requirements, and they can take measures to ban non-compliant packaging from the market. They're also responsible for implementing and enforcing EPR. Member states have the power to ban packaging in response to competent authority and market surveillance authority investigations. And if one member state implements a ban, and it's not disputed, other member states should also apply that EU-wide, which maintains the integrity of the internal market. And the other things that member states are in charge of are this producer guarantee. I think that's a significant new provision, as it's a major recourse for non-compliance in the case of non-payment of EPR fees, and nothing like that existed before. What other recourse is possible depends on what penalties member states each decide to set for PPWR infringement. And penalties must include fines for some very specific things. That's excessive packaging, the sort of flouting of Annex 5 restrictions, for reuse and refill system requirements and targets where those things are not met. So that will be financial fines. Market surveillance authorities, they investigate packaging that they have a reason to believe is non-compliant with sustainability requirements. They must allow manufacturers the opportunity to bring packaging into conformity, and that's also the case with competent authorities. And then if packaging remains non-compliant, they must take measures to withdraw, recall, or restrict it from the market. So economic operators will talk a bit more about what they are meant to be doing in terms of supply chain enforcement in the next section. And the Commission has its role, which is to rule on disputed bans and decide if they are applicable EU-wide. So before we go into the next section, which is about who is responsible for these things in more detail, the PPWR will have financial impacts on producers through design changes for packaging, from sourcing recycled materials, which are more expensive, for EPR fees, penalties for non-compliance can cost companies, and if packaging is banned, it could mean unsold stock. Administrative impacts, they need to evidence compliance, they have reporting requirements, and they will need to comply with labeling requirements, including managing the additional information supplied through QR codes. And then there's a potential reputational impact if they are non-compliant and packaging is taken off the market, or if penalties are applied, it doesn't look good for a company. So yeah, who is responsible? In the main, the PPWR says it seeks to clearly define one obligated producer per packaging unit, and the preceding directive had very little to say about any of this. So the PPWR for EPR, it places more onus on brands and producers of packaged products rather than unfilled packaging. The producer can be an importer or distributor as well as the manufacturer. And who is responsible of those depends on who places the item on the market, who makes it available for the first time. So on the left, whether the producer of packaged products or packaging is responsible depends mainly on the packaging type and the company size. So for sales packaging and grouped packaging, EPR mostly applies to the producers of packaged products, with the exceptions of service packaging and for some small companies. Whereas for transport packaging and primary production packaging, the packaging producer is always responsible. So the producer can be a manufacturer, importer, or distributor. If a brand is having a packaging or packaged product manufactured under its own name, it's responsible, it's considered the manufacturer. And this could also be a retailer, for example. So that's just a little bit of detail. And in terms of who's placing a product on the market, if the manufacturer is established in the same country that the item is placed on the market, well, they are responsible. And if it's an imported good, then if a producer from another country or outside the EU supplies an EU end user directly, that external sort of producer is responsible, and otherwise it's the first distributor or importer in a member state. In addition, there's an obligation, if nobody else can be found who's responsible, a producer who unpacks products but is not the end user, and no one else is liable, they are deemed the producer. So that's a massive whip through. So sorry, that was so fast. For sustainability requirements, things are a little bit different. The compliance is the responsibility of the manufacturer, and most onus is on brands and manufacturers of packaging compared to importers or distributors. And so for manufacturers, it's a brand if they're having packaging manufactured under their own name. They must conduct the conformity assessment procedure, keep all the technical documentation on file, and provide documentation to the national authorities on request, except for some small companies. The packaging supplier, so if a brand is having something manufactured under its own name, then the packaging supplier has an obligation to supply all the information necessary for the conformity assessment procedure. And all supply chain actors, however, have a responsibility to ensure packaging they place on the market or make available is compliant, not make non-compliant packaging available on the market, and report non-compliant packaging to the Market Surveillance Authority. And we also have a tiny bit extra detail, as if we need any more. Importers and distributors can be considered the manufacturer if they modify packaging in a way that could alter compliance, and then they have to fill in the conformity assessment procedure. It's their responsibility. So that is that. Yeah, and oh yeah, and I'm just thinking there was just something little to say here. about online retailers. So even for EPR, even if they are not an obligated producer, other economic operators like distributors, they still have this role to ensure, for example, that obligated producers are EPR registered. Online platforms or fulfillment service providers, they must make best efforts to ensure users are EPR compliant. So yeah, all the economic operators have a role to ensure compliance. It's not just member states, competent authorities and market surveillance authorities. It's a sort of a shared endeavour. So it's complicated. Who is responsible is complicated, and Eunomia can help assess who's liable for the packaging you use, for what requirements and to what extent, can help plan how to comply with EPR or how to ensure compliance with EPR, how to do that verification, and plan how to show compliance with sustainability requirements, because the manufacturer has to determine how to do that. There are frameworks specified in the PPWR, but they're not fully elaborated. And so recyclability requirements.
Chiarina,
oh yeah, sorry,
just
so much
jump
detail.
in. I'm just aware of the time.
Yeah,
so I was wondering whether we talk about the recyclability requirements and then we perhaps jump on to the kind of next steps. So we've got some time to answer questions.
Yeah, sorry, thank you very much. Recyclability requirements. So this is one of the sustainability requirements. All packaging must be recyclable. It's formalized as packaging must be designed for recycling and it must be recycled at scale. And the legislation has set out a framework for the assessment, which defines grades, recyclability grades, according to percentage designed for recycling and percentage recycled at scale. And there are targets associated with this. So by 2030, there will be a ban on packaging that doesn't meet A, B, or C grades, and that so if it's less than 70% designed for recycling. 2035, in addition, packaging must be more than 55% recycled. Have a recycling rate of 55%, and by 2038, it will be packaging has to be A and B grades and above a higher threshold for recycling, but we just don't know what that is at the moment. It's going to be determined in the future. So packaging has to be both designed for recycling and meet grades, and it also has to be recycled at scale to a certain threshold. Fail one, fail both. It needs to be both things. And the kinds of parameters that will be used to determine whether something is designed for recycling or not. The assessment considers how these parameters are predicted to affect recycling, materials, what format it is, whether it has barriers or coatings, labels or sleeves, product residues, so whether the packaging can be emptied easily or whether it tends to be contaminated, inks and lacquers, colorants, adhesives, whether it has closures, other small components, and their separability. And all of these parameters are assessed according to whether they might cause poor sorting, process losses, or poor quality, and that includes whether they would contaminate their own streams or the streams of other materials. And then they get assigned a recyclability score. That's in very simple terms. And actually, the full extent and the stringency of the assessment has not yet been determined, and that will be determined in a future legislative act by 2028. And then we have recycled at scale. So the design for recycling assessment is sort of about how well items could potentially be recycled. And this is a measure of how well recycling actually works in practice. And so it will be conducted according to 13 material classes, which is significant because the level of granularity has a big influence on how stringent the requirements are. And currently for plastics, only PET, for example, would meet the threshold for the first threshold for recycling at scale, which is 55%. And all of these other categories, flexible plastics, polystyrene, rigid polyethylene, polypropylene, HDPE, PVC, polycarbonates, all of those are currently under that threshold. But there is time for the market to catch up with that. There's 10 years before this threshold comes in. So hopefully this will be a good good motivation. And the threshold for 2038 will be decided by a future act by 2030. So this, for sustainability requirements, frameworks are provided for recyclability and beyond, also for packaging minimization, and there are all the other sustainability requirements. Frameworks are provided, but not all the detail has been worked out. So Eunomia can help navigate the uncertainties and assess your packaging portfolio according to a defined range of scenarios and help define your sustainability strategy. A company can decide whether they just want to comply with regulations or whether they want to compete in terms of sustainable offerings or whether they want to lead. And that's something we're really interested in. Eunomia have already been conducting recyclability assessments for major brands and using existing national frameworks as well as expected EU requirements. And we've developed assessments based on these frameworks to allow risks to be managed and ensure investment in new packaging design is well directed. Next section, when do the requirements apply? Shall we skip through this and go to
should we jump? Yeah, let's jump to section 5 and then we can squeeze in a few questions. But there's been loads of questions in the chat, so
my goodness,
respond to everyone offline if we need to. But yeah, I think let's jump to section 5.
Okay, I can give. There's a timeline. There's a lot of stuff happening. This is the recyclability requirements, and there's lots of areas of uncertainty. There's a lot of things that will be determined by future acts. We have up to 40 of them, and we have a really good handle on when those things are happening and what they're going to cover. And most of this is happening in the next 3 years, but there's also a cluster of future acts that'll determine details around 2031 and 2032. And one of the things we can do is help understand the uncertainties around timing and provide good visibility of future developments in legislation. So next steps for businesses is so the PPWR is going to set the agenda on packaging for the next 10 to 20 years. It's really significant. And so a business needs to identify their obligations, plan how they will achieve and demonstrate compliance, and closely monitor regulatory updates. And Eunomia and that's according to lots of different sustainability requirements, and we have experience in all of those. And I'm going to provide a couple of case studies to show the kinds of things that we have done with clients. So we have worked for major fast-moving consumer goods manufacturers to assess their packaging portfolio for PPWR compliance risks. We developed a framework for assessing recyclability of packaging, adequacy of packaging minimization, recycled content requirements, and relevance of restrictions. And so the producer then was provided with a risk assessment across its packaging portfolio with prioritized recommendations for action, what risks to mitigate and what to avoid when innovating in packaging. And this is an example of an output just for one packaging format, and a manufacturer might have thousands of these, and we've worked to deliver automated approaches. So it covers risks, the impacts and recommendations across several dimensions, and the recommendations are prioritized across the biggest risks and impacts, which are classed as critical, and then advised and optional recommendations. And then on reuse, we have a model called ReSim to understand the costs and benefits of transitioning to reuse systems. This was used to make an online tool that could be used by beverage sellers to understand, what would be the outcomes of transitioning to reuse. And the online tool, you can change the inputs, what kind of containers are being switched from to, what the return rate is, and see live outputs. Outputs include savings in materials for container manufacturing or waste management costs, environmental outputs, reduction in the consumption of single-use containers, reduced littering, water savings, greenhouse gas savings, and social impacts like new green jobs. And as well as online tools, we can also produce standalone reports on that. And that's it. It's a hell of a lot of stuff to get through in half an hour. So I hope you don't feel completely bland and that you feel like you understood what is coming a little bit better.
Thanks, Chiarina. That was a really good presentation and quite a fly through of what is a very lengthy regulation. I think the other thing Chiarina brought out there is that there's quite a few of the questions that are in the chat where the answer is going to be, it depends on the delegated and implementing acts that are still to come, or possibly on how member states choose to make some of these things happen. So we are going to go to the questions now. We're going to give it a go at answering some of them, but we don't know all the answers because the Commission hasn't decided all of the answers to these as it stands today. Now, people have upvoted things in two different ways. Some have used the upvote button and some have used the thumbs up. So apologies if I don't agree with your ordering. I'm going to start with a question which I don't know, maybe it's one for me to answer rather than you, Chiarina, but there's been lots of interest. Will there be enough recycled plastic available to meet the recycled content goals? There's a couple of questions along that line, and I guess my answer to that, and Chiarina, feel free to come in, is the Commission's intent is that the answer to that question is going to be yes, and that the PPWR, the Waste Framework Directive, other EU and national policy will mean that, yes, we do collect enough recycled plastic and it is sufficient quality. My personal view would be, I think there's a lot more that would need to be done to make that the true answer. And I think that's something where, yeah, we need to keep an eye on European and national policies around recycling rates, collection rates and quality, but I don't know if there's anything you would add to that, Chiarina.
Yeah, I mean, initially, in the short to medium term, there will be a strain on supply within the EU, but that will be met by probably by imports of PCR, of post-consumer recycled content from abroad. And then, there are requirements that it has to be made according to certain sustainability requirements, and they're all still to be determined. But there probably won't be a shortage in that it will be bought from abroad. Prices will be higher, and how that develops over the time will depend on, whether EU capacity comes and collection and treatment capacity comes online, and how fast. Yeah.
Okay. The next question that I think has got the most votes across those two categories is about the recycled content targets, and who needs to fulfill the targets per manufacturing plant. Is it the brand owner that places the packaging and the final product on the market? Is it the plastic converter producing the packaging? Who holds the recycled content target?
Well, so the recycled content target is a sustainability requirement. So that has to be met by the manufacturer. That's a responsibility of the manufacturer. It has to be met per plant per year. And it also has to be met for 22 different material and packaging type categories. So I would say my first stab would be it's the manufacturer that has to do that. Yeah. But I would want to go and look in more detail and consult with some of our experts, just, to be sure of that interpretation. It's very specific. And, there is also a question around, the chain of custody mechanism, the verification mechanism, which will actually involve information sharing between multiple economic operators. That's another layer that will come on top of verifying recycled content. So it is going to be complex, I think.
Yeah, I think streamlining that chain of evidence is going to be a really important part of how the system works and what businesses need to think about, because yes, I mean, I think the EU's intent is that everybody in the chain is doing the right thing, and those conformity assessments and so on would be one of the bits of evidence you might want if you're further up the chain, and so on. I'm aware of time, and we're gonna try and fit in one more. Well, let's pick one about reuse because it's one of Eunomia's favourite topics. Are reuse targets at retailer level? Are there any producer level requirements around reuse?
So there are producer level requirements around reuse. The targets, depending on the item, are for retailers and for users. So for beverages, for example, that's a retailer level target. The requirements that are on producers are ensuring that reuse systems are in place and meet minimum requirements. For example, that's something for producers, that their packaging meets the minimum number of rotations. That's going to be a sustainability requirement. So that's with manufacturers. So yes, there are reuse requirements that producers have to meet.
And I think there's quite a lot of thinking that may need to be done on how that really plays out in terms of national implementation and shared responsibilities. People on the call be familiar with existing EPR, PROs and deposit return system operators, and to make those reuse targets happen, in my personal view, we are going to need some similar kind of structures to share responsibility and infrastructure and so on. So I think that's the case. Right. I'm aware that we are at time, and my colleague will probably be like, no, we're finishing on time for this one. We have made a note of all the questions we've been asked and who's asked them. So we will get back to everyone with a considered response on that. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to Chiarina for a thorough presentation. Hopefully that has given people a sense of just how much detail there is in there when you really get into it. Hope the whistle stop tour was useful. We'd be delighted to hear from you if you have further questions, if you'd like a more targeted conversation on any of the PPWR topics. If you're enjoying our webinar series, the next Fit for the Future webinar will be at the end of May, on the 27th. That's not been revealed publicly, but that is the case. And we'll be getting a grip on Scope 3 emissions, and that'll be led by Eunomia's low carbon team. But from us, in terms of packaging policy, there'll be lots to do over the next few years, and do please reach out if you are interested in a further discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.